So hello and thank you for joining us today. I'm Detective Inspector Fiona Bail, the Head of Cyber and Innovation at the Eastern Cyber Resilience Centre. The Eastern Cyber Resilience Centre is a Home Office supported, NPCC and regionally police funded, police-led, not-for-profit business with the aim of increasing SMEs cyber resilience through our free of charge membership. So today I'm joined by 3 members of our advisory group to discuss the business risks around the use of personal devices for work and potential mitigations. So I'll start by introducing the panellists joining me. So ladies first, Kim, would you like to introduce yourself and tell everyone who you are and what your experience is in this area?
Sure, thank you, Fiona, and hello everyone. My name is Kim Bradford. I am a consultant, independent consultant in the fields of data protection and also human resources, which is a bit of an odd mix for some, but given that HR tends to have an awful lot of personal data for all of their workers, they seem to fit quite well for me. So happy to be on the panel today.
Okay, and Professor Christian Kemp.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Christian and I'm an academic from Anglia Ruskin University. My specialisms are in cybercrime and policing, and I recently was the lead investigator on a study that looked at how we can best or better protect businesses in the Eastern region from the risk of cybercrime. And I've spoken to quite a few victims of cybercrime, and BYOD, or bring your own devices, is a key or potential vulnerability that can precede attacks. So hopefully able to share a few insights from what I've gathered during research and speaking to victims and feed into the discussion. Thanks, Fiona.
Excellent. And last but not least even, Steve Mair.
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name's Steve Mair. I'm a principal consultant at Bradwell Consulting. I've been in cyber for way too many years to contemplate since before email was common, which is a bit scary. And I've worked with SMEs, one-man bands, all the way up to governments and multinationals. So very happy to be part of the panel today, and looking forward to a good discussion.
Brilliant. Okay, so as you said before, any questions that come up whilst we're talking, please feel free to use the chat and we'll get around to answering them. So a little bit of background about why this topic is key for businesses. So according to Microsoft, regardless of the office's official bring your own device policy, 2 out of 3 employees use their device at work. And even if it's forbidden, some people utilise their devices anyway in one way or another. Cytonic state that more than 1/3, so 32% of their employees interviewed, used at least 6 mobile apps daily, and 11% used more than 10 apps daily related to work. But more than 51% of organisations provided apps to at least one other party, so such as hourly workers, contracted employees, dealer networks, or even business partners. And not surprisingly, email, calendar and contact management are the most popular type of apps enabled, with 84% of employees using at least one of those, according to crowd research. An additional 45% of employees use it for document accessing and editing, and 43% use it to access a SharePoint or an intranet site. And finally, almost all companies agree that BYOD is growing and it's likely here to stay. So I think we need to understand the benefits, but also the risks in this area. So Steve, if I can come to you first, can you give us actually a definition about what BYOD actually is and what it covers?
Sure. So Christian's already given away what the acronym stands for. I was going to lead with, it's variously known as bring your own data loss or bring your own disaster, but it is bring your own device. So it is bring your own personal device into the organisation. It's closely allied, I guess, to shadow IT, which is IT that's been bought by members of the company for company work, but without the knowledge of the IT team. But we'll focus on BYOD at the moment. So the biggest issue with BYOD is exactly that. It is your personal device. You're responsible for managing it and maintaining it. And therefore, the company does not have clear sight of how secure that device is and whether specific controls are in place. And I guess that's what we're going to talk about this morning. So.
Absolutely. So you've mentioned some the potential risk. There must be some benefits though to using BYOD. Kim, can you sort of say a couple?
There definitely are. It used to be quite viewed as quite an executive perk to be able to bring your brand new iPhone to work, as opposed to using the rather rubbish device that you were possibly issued from the company. But I think, you know, there are an awful lot of hidden workers out there who bring their own devices that lots of organisations don't stop to think about, such as freelancers, contractors, and the gig economy means that, you know, if you are self-employed or even work on fixed-term contracts as a PAYE, but you're quite a fluid part of the workforce, there are obvious benefits to an organisation with not having to provide all of those people with devices that might only be utilised, used and abused potentially for a short period of time. So it's a lot easier and it's a lot more flexible for them to be able to bring people in who've got their own devices. Although obviously, you know, where you might be doing away with sort of theft of company or damage to company property by issuing mobile devices, you then cancel out that particular risk and then introduce the risk that would be inherent in inviting some other devices into your network or onto your data systems.
So I heard that also there's some research into its higher productivity for employees because they've got that functionality, they know their own device, they can work through it quickly. And then that would lead to also I suppose we're all very used to working out of offices now and wherever we fancy it. And BYOD helps to bring that culture still.
It does, although interestingly, the government are looking at bringing in a bill for the automatic right or the inherent right for workers to be able to switch off. So that always on might actually end up being something that employers might have to negotiate with their workers rather than just assume.
Okay. Christian, do you have any sort of benefits around BYOD?
Not necessarily a benefit, but a comment to springboard off the back of Kim's point about almost like the new reality of remote working and the culture that we're in at the moment and the always on phenomena. And if I can sort of put my sociologist or my criminologist's hat on for a second and think about what it is that potential cyber criminals stand to gain from BYOD and remote working, it's they try to exploit this blending of these two worlds and how the boundaries between both are so blurred now. So I think, you know, whereas once upon a time, working in the workplace came with a certain amount of messaging, rules and regulations around what you could do and couldn't do, now where that's being blended with home life means that, you know, it's far less clear in terms of what the rules are, what you can and can't do. And also what's really interesting is almost how the personal apps and the personal devices we use are all about making you feel calm, trusting, confident when sharing information online, whereas all the sort of work side of things is about controlling what you do and don't share. And those two things are quite at odds with one another. So really it's about trying to help businesses and staff understand how to keep those two worlds separate, even though they might cohabit on these personal devices, which almost sociologically and criminologically as well is quite interesting.
Absolutely. Steve, what are your thoughts?
So one of the benefits, I guess, to the company is it's cheaper because they're not having to buy all this IT infrastructure. And for some employees, it also means that they are perhaps only carrying one phone around rather than having a work phone, a personal phone, and multiple other devices. So I think that is another reason why organisations are looking at it, is because it's easier to transport and easier to move around. Interestingly, just talking about the majority of people looking at using personal devices, there was an article in the Times on Sunday just gone in the cybersecurity supplement called Raconteur. And in that it says that 61% of UK employees use their own mobile phones for business purposes. 44% use their own laptops, and 61% intend to return to the office with their personal devices. So that kind of gives an idea of the scale of issue that or concerns that security professionals will have around this mass influx of personal devices, because prior to COVID, I don't think that the numbers were quite that high. So I think that the challenge is going to be for security teams who traditionally, many years back, they were renowned as being the people that say no. They're now the people who say yes if you do it this way, but if they don't know that the devices are there, how do they know how to protect it? So I think that's the big challenge for the organisation, and is one of the reasons why they're so wary about bring your own device.
Yeah, and I suppose linked in with that use of personal equipment is also the fact that people take it everywhere. So actually the risk of that theft of devices is actually a huge risk as well, especially if you haven't got the security plans in place that companies enforce.
Yeah, that is probably the biggest concern for organisations, because mobile phones go missing all the time. I haven't seen the recent stats, but certainly a few years back, I think I did see that something like 20,000 mobile phones a year were being left in London cabs. So if those are all personal devices with corporate data on them, and you've got no facility in place to remotely wipe those, then that's a big issue. The same goes with laptops, the same goes with tablet devices, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I read an article, or a snippet, I suppose, about a 2012 case where a doctor had his laptop stolen. It was a personal laptop. Unfortunately, he'd also got all of his patients' data on his hard drive.
Yeah.
The company that he worked for got fined $1.5 million because of that. And I was like, oh, that's going to stop some people from doing it again, isn't it? What are you talking
Yeah, and that fine's likely to be larger now with GDPR being in place.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So they're sort of the risks, I suppose, that so the data protection point of view, the dual sort of merging of those personal and work lives, that always on presence. In fact, on that thing, IT Pro Portal said that BYODs work normally an extra 2 hours a day. So checking emails like before they even start work officially. So I think that well-being is definitely an issue that companies need to consider. And I suppose also we brought up lack of policy as well. Go on, Christian.
Yeah, just you made me think of a point there, Fiona, which is, if you're working more hours as well, it's when you're tired or overworked that you make those mistakes, and you get a little bit more sort of relaxed in terms of how you're using those devices. So that's a big problem and issue as well.
Absolutely. So what do you think the main things are that businesses need to consider when they're sort of looking at a BYOD? Steve.
Excellent. I knew that was coming my way. So there are a number of things, but I think you hit on the first one immediately, is clear policy on what is permitted, what's not permitted. If you are going to allow BYOD, what controls have you got in place? So, for example, making sure that you've got some method of being able to remotely wipe the device, as we mentioned there, but also when the device is brought into the office, and this actually goes for returning workers going back into the office now, taking their corporate devices. They've been sat on your home network, they've been sat in whatever other network other than corporate controlled. Those devices need to be scanned for malware before they get allowed back on the network. So organizations need to have some kind of process in place to make that transparent and easy for individuals. One of the issues that you have with implementing good security is if it's not straightforward and it's not easy to use, people will find a way to circumvent it. Yeah, they always look for the path of least resistance. So if you can make the secure way the easiest way, then you're more likely to get compliance.
I like that idea of having that easy option.
Yeah.
What about you, Kim?
I wholeheartedly agree with what Steve says, and I think that then brings in the other half of it, because you're never going to win hearts and minds by just pushing out a policy to your staff. Half them won't read it, and we all know that people can be extraordinarily inventive in bypassing security protocols. So then it comes down to not just the policy that goes around it, but also the why. Why do we have this? Why does this matter to us as an organisation, and therefore why should it matter to you as a worker or an employee of this organisation? So that bridge between policy And I guess behaviour needs to be communication and awareness, and that ties in with training as well. You know, the best policy in the world and the best security in the world will always fall under the weight of inertia or you know, active sort of working against it that you might find from your staff. And therefore, you know, that is why you would need to perhaps involve other parts of the business. So yes, IT and the people who have responsibility for security and information security and cybersecurity will also then need to speak to the people within HR to ensure that all of the policies tie up, that your social media policy, your acceptable IT use, your disciplinary policy, your code of conduct policies, all of these tie in, and then that you are then putting out the right kind of training and awareness on a consistent basis to ensure that you're addressing the behaviours, because most breaches happen because of human error, to be honest.
Steve?
Yeah, just to echo that, I mean, training is massively important on this, and it shouldn't be. So again, years gone by, it's been a tick box exercise. Here's a bunch of PowerPoint slides, and the competition is how fast can you get through it to the end, which does nothing to improve employee behaviour and awareness. So it needs to be, exactly as you said, Kim, related to the why are we doing this? Yeah, what's the benefit to the individuals for doing this? What's the benefit to the company? And if you can make it more human, and if you can relate that back to personal use at home, because we know that the bad guys, the attackers, aren't just going for business users, they're going for people at home as well. So it needs to be that holistic type of training which looks at the benefits but also looks at how users can benefit and can protect themselves at home as well as at work. It's not one size fits all. So excuse me, the training for your IT team is going to be different from the training from your HR team, as it's going to be different for, I don't know, people who are answering phones or working in a call centre or what have you. Yeah. So it is much more nuanced than it used to be.
Christian, what do you think about employee behaviour and sort of BYOD, sort of circumventing maybe?
Thanks, Fiona. If I put my researcher hat on, I mentioned earlier that I'd spoken to a few victims of cybercrime, and in some of those cases, BYOD had been the point of entry, or how those attacks had taken place. Personal devices had been infiltrated, and data had been leaked, stolen. And in the case of two businesses, I can't name who the businesses were or talk in too much detail about the scale of the damage caused, but I revisited the interviews and had a look at what it was that they said they didn't do and what they were planning to do as a means of changing. So they gave me a series of points that they mentioned were things that they wish they had in place before. The first of which was they had no mechanisms in place to prevent sensitive data from being extracted from these personal devices that were being used. No software installed on the devices for encryption, and no training was given to staff around BYOD. There was no clear guidance either in terms of what personal devices could or couldn't be used for. And there was no consideration either of the how to secure the sort of sending and receiving of data between organizations and supply chains as well. And the employer wasn't really sure or certain as to how many devices were being used and what they were being used for. And the classic as well was software wasn't kept up to date. So in this context, there are two businesses in particular that I spoke to. The breaches, the scale of which still aren't fully known in terms of how much data and what data was breached, were breached basically because personal devices were being used by kids and children studying from home. So those devices would be used during the day by parents and then used by the kids in the evening who were using it for studying at home, but also Netflix, apps, and things like that. And the suspicion was in that case that malware then got onto those personal devices and allowed the infiltration. So really, if you sort of backward or reverse engineer from the things that those businesses didn't do, you can then get a clear sense into what some of the key steps could be to mitigate against those risks.
Okay, so we've had a question from Paul saying that some companies have discussed stopping staff bringing their own phones into the office completely to try and stop them from playing on social media rather than work. Kim, what's your view around that one?
Oh, the introduction of the nanny state. I would say, you know, it always comes down to what's reasonable and proportionate, right? So is this a reasonable response to an issue that they have evidence of in order to achieve a, you know, a reasonable outcome? Is it proportionate? So if this is massively a problem and they have all the evidence in the world, possibly, but again, it would go in with policy and it would go in with an explanation. And I would say in this day and age, we should be more about the productivity and the output. People need regular breaks sometime from what they're doing. And if that break is a walk around the park or go to the shop to get some milk or play a few rounds on your favourite game on the apps, what does it matter? So I'm not massively in favour of this unless it is absolutely a huge problem, either for productivity, for data security, and so on and so forth.
I think that's a really good point actually about those regular breaks, because I suppose if you look at the office maybe 20, 30 years ago, almost everyone would have smoked and they'd have had their cigarette breaks at regular intervals through the day, and actually taking that out, you are left with that long period of time. And you're absolutely right, people can't concentrate for that long. So yeah, that's quite an interesting one, saying actually it's just a way of having that little attention span broken. So I suppose you're talking about policies, but do you think it's important for companies to recognise what actually employees want to use on their phone and what systems they actually need to use, rather than giving them, you know, blanket access to everything? What do you think, Steve?
Yeah, I think organisations do still have the responsibility to understand how they want to run their business and what applications they need to be using to run the business. And yes, they should probably review that on a regular basis to see whether whatever kind of CRM type tool that they're using, whether that's appropriate now. You've been using it for the last 10 years. Is it still, you know, has it scaled? Is it providing the services that you need? I think it's worthwhile having conversations with employees to find out what apps are they using regularly at home, or if they're using their own devices, what apps are they using? Why are they using those? Why are they better than the work ones? And by all means have that dialogue, because as I said earlier, you know, the role of security isn't to say no. The role of security is to secure the organisation. And if that means that you're looking to change a set of applications or to allow particular applications, so long as you do that in a secure manner, then I don't really see what the problem is with that. And I think having that conversation with employees, it means that they are more engaged, that they feel more valued, that they feel heard within the organisation. And again, it comes back to, you know, this link between security and HR is having a happy workforce from that perspective, knowing that they feel valued and heard, will actually help with retention and staff and things like that, and also reduces the risk of insider threat.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So Samson said that only 17% of businesses provide phones for their staff, which would indicate that a large number of companies are relying on either the not use of mobile phones at all, or people using their personal devices. What actually can employees or employers do, though, to actually enforce controls if they're relying on other people having the technology? I mean, Christian, do you or Kim want to take those ones?
I know.
You know, go for it, Steve.
I think we're all going to have an opinion on that.
Yes. Yeah. I'll let Christian go first, since you asked him first.
It's okay, after you, Steve. I scratch my head over that one while you answer.
So I have in the past, I've had to do exactly this, to identify what kind of tools we're going to use to control personal devices, and it almost always comes down to some kind of mobile device management platform. where basically you can create a secure container on the device. So it's a secure file storage area where corporate data can't be moved out of that container onto the rest of the device, and likewise personal data can't be moved into that container. There's a number of different tools around there, so I'm not going to name any just now, but that's one way of being able to register the device. It also gives you the control where you can check whether or not the latest software releases have been updated on that device. You can do a remote wipe on the device if it's reported as lost. So therefore, you need to have a process. Yeah, my device has been lost or stolen. You report it, it gets remote wiped. I've actually tested that inadvertently myself by leaving a phone on a train once, and it's quite an interesting process to work through. But that gives you the opportunity. One of the things that you may need to do is to amend your HR processes and your contract to say, as an employee, you give your employer permission to remove software on their device. And some people might not be happy with that. If they're not happy with it, then let them use a corporate device. It's their choice.
Yeah.
I think Steve used a very interesting word there, which was control. And extraordinarily, or possibly not surprisingly, workers and employees, and especially contractors, are extremely unwilling to hand over their personal devices to an IT or to an IT department in order for them to install any kind of software on there that might share control over what you can and can't do with that device. So absolutely, Steve hits the nail on the head. That's the most secure and safe way of doing it. But in all practicality, and I can remember contracting a while back for British Airways, who at the time was still operating off Lotus Notes. So I had to hand my personal devices over to IT so that they could install that onto my personal devices. It was a flipping nightmare, to be perfectly honest. And it does then bring in that whole blurred lines of who manages, who maintains, and who controls this device. And I think it's a difficult one. Yes, it would be ideal, but trying to work that into your contracts, into your policies, I imagine you would come across a fair amount of pushback. And then it then brings back the whole, well, what's the benefit of this? And why don't we just give them, give them mobile devices that the company then has to purchase?
Yeah, and I came across all of those, Kim. It was unsurprisingly, but we did have quite a large estate. We developed a process where it was auto registration, so IT didn't physically get a hold of the device. You're able to push out the relevant bits and pieces, and we would run regular reports just to find out, so and so hasn't patched. One of the main reasons why we had to do it was an awful lot of the workforce had gone out and bought iPhones, and company policy was not iPhones.
And I'm sure Christian will agree with I suppose the whole employee value proposition piece that's on this. But then you're moving away from individual accountability and ownership of the risk that they introduce or that they take through use of mobile devices that are their own for work purposes, and you're moving much more towards, well, all of that onus for the behaviour and what they can and can't do then sits with the employer, which is, I think, a more difficult step backwards. And I can see Christian nodding, so I'll let him add.
Absolutely.
So
thanks, Kim.
Sorry, just before you do, you were saying there about the risk, sort of the ownership of risk. As the data controller is the company, even if the employee is using their own device, is the risk still held with the company?
It absolutely is. It would be shared between the two of them, because if you've got your own personal device that you access your work emails on and work, you've got work contacts on there in your phone, but you've got software that can access all of your contacts, and just say that software is an app that you play a game on and introduces a risk to your phone, you can't just push all of that responsibility and accountability off onto the employer, because it's your personal device, and it's a choice and it's an agreement between the two. And I think moving away from safe behaviours online and on your devices is not the way to go. I think individuals should be aware and accountable, and that brings us back to the whole training and sort of communication information piece.
Sorry, Christian.
That's all right, Fiona. I think the discussion so far just reveals how complex it is, and that it's a negotiation, isn't it, between those two, in terms of where the risk sits and how you mitigate against it. And, you know, a lot of what I do is around the culture of that negotiation between those two. But I think I would agree with everything that's been said so far. Yeah, just to say how complex it is, really.
Brilliant. So where you have people utilising their own devices, I've got a question about whether staff should be able to claim expenses, or should be employers actually be paying stipends for that use, I suppose, for work stuff?
Short answer, why not?
Yeah. Steve?
Short answer, it's complicated, I think. Yeah, I think you could say why not. If employers are specifically requiring people to use their personal devices, then yes. If the employers are giving them an option of using their own device or a company device, and the company devices are appropriate for the job required, perhaps not. Yeah.
Okay.
I'll sit on the fence on that one.
Christian, would you have any views?
Yeah, I think if we're talking about negotiations between these two groups, it's almost like it's a bit of a buy-in and building in that relationship, isn't it? If you have an expectation that you're placing on staff, then how do you get that buy-in from them, and you build that relationship around not only this, but other things you might be expecting them to do. So it could be a really good and really powerful way to build that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So another comment's been made that many police forces have prevented the use of secure messaging platforms on job smartphones, so WhatsApp in particular, which then has driven police officers to obviously work around that and potentially use personal devices, and have unofficial operational communication, shall we say.
It's not just job related. It happens everywhere.
So where you said, Steve, that IT should be, instead of saying no, they should be enabling these new applications, I suppose, or new ways of communicating. I suppose how do you promote that as an employer or employee? Really,
I think this one is particularly difficult, because by their very nature, things like WhatsApp and Telegram and others are encrypted end to end.
Yeah.
You therefore can't see what's being done on them. As an employer, you can't see what's being done, even if you've got access to the individual's phone.
So is it better to have their own messaging?
It's really tricky, I think, because some of these applications allow file transfer, and that's always my biggest concern. You can share a certain amount of information through text messaging, but to make it worth somebody's while trying to exfiltrate data, they need to really be doing some kind of file transfer. So if your platform, whatever that may be, is capable of file transfer, that's when you've got a bigger issue, I think. Having almost unofficial channels to chat on personal devices, I've seen that across lots of industries, lots of sectors, and lots of organisations. I've used them myself, and that's been with the blessing of the organisation. It is, certainly in some parts of the world, it is the way that business is done through WhatsApp. Meetings are being arranged. Phone calls are done on WhatsApp because you're not paying local phone charges. You're just paying your Wi-Fi or data charges, etc. So I think it's a really tricky way to go ahead, and as with all things tricky, make sure you've got it well documented, what's acceptable, what isn't. Make sure you've communicated that, train that, and that becomes part of your training. It becomes part of your contract of employment, etc., etc. So
absolutely. I suppose moving on from that and looking at, if you don't have control over an employee's phone and that negotiation point, and you are letting them access work systems, would be around that, making sure it's role-based only. So actually they're only accessing the data that they need to. And I suppose that comes back to actually looking at what do they need to be able to access in the first place.
Exactly. Yeah.
Kim?
I think let me just lower my hand there. I think Steve's hit on a few things there. And if I can interpose a HR perspective on this as well, you then also need to think about potentials. So you have to have the question of, is this employer endorsed? In which case, does it then tie into acceptable codes of conduct and policies and training, as Steve says? But also then, where is the line for any misuse or abuse that can potentially happen on these things? So I've had previous examples where, you know, informal messaging systems have sprung up and then are used you know, to perhaps spread rumours or harassment, which can be very personal. And let's not forget, when you sign up for WhatsApp, it will invariably tie to your personal phone number. So then you're using your personal phone number sort of across the boundaries of work and personal as well. And then, you know, if there is needed some kind of employee relations case or investigation, you're then asking for evidence and access to things like personal messaging systems or messaging systems that are mixed in with personal and work related on a personal device. And, you know, subject access requests throw this up all the time. And, you know, most subject access requests that hit HR are usually sent in anger because of a grievance or disciplinary. So you're always going to come across these particular issues. And I think it's definitely something to be quite wary of. Far better to use something that ties in with whatever systems a company already has in place. Yes, it means that you have to use another system or another application on your personal device. But if it's for work purposes and the work or employer are able to provide it, use that and keep your personal WhatsApp, for example, personal use.
Yeah, I think I agree with that one. Looking at actually people potentially circumventing, or maybe not, but obviously if people are using their own devices and they've got work stuff on there and then they leave the company, how do companies deal with that?
I wrote that one down earlier. That comes down again to inventory. Yeah. Who's going to maintain it? And if you don't even know that this is there in the first place, and I have had examples with clients before where someone's left the business and they had their own personal device, and therefore IT are not managing that. It doesn't fit within the remit of either internal or external IT service providers, and therefore there's real genuine harm that could be caused by an employer and ex-employee with access still to company related information, email accounts and so on. And again, that ties in then to things like your contractual non-compete and non-solicitation clauses, and enforcing those further down the track. It gets quite murky if an organisation can't prove that actually they did all they could to mitigate their loss and switch off the access to these things. And I can see both Steve and Christian are nodding their heads on that, so I'll give way.
Christian, do you want to talk about that?
I was thinking actually of different sort of example around this. Was I think there was either a working group or a committee meeting where MPs had been asked to give WhatsApp messages as evidence of, I think it was either peer donorships or money being sent around for particular purposes. And this is where it got really interesting around BYOD, because one of them was claiming that in the time in between, they had replaced their phone and therefore couldn't find them or didn't have access to all of this data and evidence. And the other one was basically saying, well, I deleted the messages and they aren't even there anymore. So you're just making me think there, Kim, around you know, how this works in contexts where staff do end up trying to use alternative messaging apps, and then what happens if this does happen, and then trying to get that data from them, and all the various excuses that can go on around that as well.
Steve, what about you?
So this is one example where using mobile device management is a really good idea, because you as an organisation could just wipe that data and the employee can't do anything about it. But totally take on board what Kim said earlier. It can be quite clunky to make happen. And also, as Christian said, if it's something like WhatsApp, that's fairly ubiquitous on most devices now. How do you remove that data? So some of it, unfortunately, comes down to trust. So it may be in your contract that you say that it says that if you leave the organisation, you undertake to ensure that all data has been returned or securely deleted. And you need to have some kind of definition of what secure deletion is, which we can maybe talk about at some point. And you then need to just make sure as part of that leaving process, you as the organisation say to the person, can you confirm that you've done this? You've got written documentation to say that they've said they've done that. Does that absolve you of any responsibility if they then go on and share that data once you've gone? Because you can say, our contract said this, the person said they've done all that we've asked them to do, they lied. How can we control that? And I'm not quite sure how that would stand up in a court of law, because potentially the argument would be the company could perhaps have done more by putting in these secure containers, etc. Perhaps, I don't know. But I think it's a really difficult area, and it comes down to, again, HR working with security, working with IT to look at how we can best put these processes and procedures in place, make sure that we have sufficient cover in contracts, etc., and manage that offboarding quite strenuously, I think.
Yeah, so I think what's coming through is that it's really important for a company to have clear policies, but also actually to communicate those really well with their staff about the expectations and responsibilities. How would you feel about actually saying that if you're using personal devices, then you must have a VPN and you must have anti-malware on your phone? Do you think that would be acceptable?
Yeah, I think that's fair.
I've done that in the past. So using network access control, for example, which is a technology which allows you to scan the device that's being connected, make sure that it meets certain requirements, which might be that it's connected over VPN, that antivirus software is up to date, that the latest patches have been applied, or at least patches with are no more than, say, a month old. And you can do that. The device gets quarantined until it's given access. Yes, it's additional cost, but it's additional control, and it's additional assurance for you. It's you demonstrating that you are managing the risk as well as you can. So again, it's another process. So for those that are listening, network access control, really good idea.
So when you talk about that, is that, so if I had a personal device and I came to your office and I said, I'm going to go on the Wi-Fi, that's when that kicks in?
It could be, but in that instance, I would actually advise organisations to set up a guest Wi-Fi, which is completely separate Wi-Fi, doesn't connect to your corporate systems, gives them access to the internet. They can do what they like, but they don't actually touch your organisation.
Okay, that's a very good one, isn't it? And I suppose talking about Wi-Fis in general, any advice around sort of guidance for home workers or who go to the coffee shop and have free Wi-Fi there and work for the day? Is that again what companies, what guidance should companies be saying to their employees about that?
Use a VPN.
Use a VPN.
And this comes, I completely agree, and I think this also ties back into the education piece and the ownership, the personal ownership and accountability for the security of your personal devices if you are using them for anything. So why would you be less careful with company and work related data than you would with regards to getting access into your own bank account? You know, take the same approach to being safe. So I'm all for the personal accountability on that.
Yeah, just as an example of that, I was doing a presentation a couple of years back at a third-party site, and part of the presentation was the use of Wi-Fi pineapples, which was basically creating a fake hotspot using this device. So when you configure it, you can say what you want it to be called, what network ID you want. So we called it Costa Wi-Fi. Yeah. And before the demo started, I think there was about 80 odd people at the event. Before the demo started, we had about 12 people connected to Costa Wi-Fi. Now, the nearest Costa was 30 miles away. Yeah, they still connected. And so, you know, yes, you can jump on it. And the thing is, if you had a VPN and you jumped on that Costa Wi-Fi, even though it was a fake Wi-Fi, they can't read your traffic, therefore they can't access your data, therefore you're going to be more secure. That is one reason why keep using it. I use a VPN on my personal devices when I'm out and about, and exactly as Kim said, when you're accessing your bank details, anything that's got credit card payments or any kind of payment side of things, make sure you use that,
I think Christian will agree with his sociology background that everyone likes a freebie, but free does not mean safe or secure.
Absolutely. The cyber protect officers who do the inputs and training across the East and the UK more nationally use pineapples as well, Steve, because they're so powerful to say, make sure that what you think you're connecting to when you're in that cafe is actually, the legitimate Wi-Fi that's available. So, definitely 100% agree with you.
So one of our other AGs is actually listening in, Francis West, and he's actually recommending 1.1.1.1 VPN, which is a free VPN software.
Okay, so can I counter that?
Because go for it.
Any software that is free, think about why it's free. Yeah, you're the product. So for me personally, if I'm talking about securing my data and my network, I'm not going to use anything that's free. I'm going to use a paid service where I've got a paid service agreement and a paid contract.
Okay, so he says the paid version is £5 a month for 5 devices. So that's not hopefully going to break anyone's back. So
I would advise steer clear of all free services. If it's a paid service, it's likely to be a little bit more secure. So.
Okay, so actually in terms of those maybe free services, free applications, people thinking that they want to have actually the latest game that their neighbours got, but it's not on their device, and they decide to go to an unofficial store for it. What can be the risks of installing I suppose, verified applications, software onto devices? Steve?
Who's going to take that? Me? I'll go for it. So the risks are, everybody's smiling because I think for those of us who work in it, we're well aware of that. A, you might not get the software that you think you're downloading anyway. B, when you get it, you might also get additional software that sits and runs in the background that gives potential attackers a foothold on your network, the potential then to drop onto other devices on your network, potentially infect them, become part of what we call a botnet, which is used to attack other organizations, other companies without your knowledge, could be used for mining cryptocurrency, for example. So using up resource on your device, it slow everything down. You'll actually open yourself up to ransomware on that as well, because that's another good way for it to be delivered. So it's a really bad idea, generally.
Okay, so official app stores only, I suppose, and that will be written into policy and will be part of the training package that companies deliver. And
a lot of organisations will create their own app store with only the software that they permit or that they recommend within the organisation, and they tell you to download from that. Sorry, Kim.
Well, I was just going to say it's fair to kind of point out, though, that Apple and Google, who arguably own the 2 biggest app stores, have been really dragging their heels. They've actually got a bit of a push and a poke on that for taking a little bit more responsibility for checking that the apps that are available in their stores are safer and secure.
Yeah. Historically, Apple have been a lot more secure because it's a lot more difficult to write code and get it approved for publication on the Apple Store. Google, because it's all Android, is rife with, unfortunately, illegitimate versions and a lot of malware. Although saying that about Apple, there's obviously the news this week where there's a new no-click malware that is available on Apple. So certainly we've seen a lot of advice on LinkedIn is if you're using an Apple device, update your software now. This is bit software that was developed by an Israeli company, allegedly for positive means, but I was listening to a really good podcast about it a couple of weeks back, and they've used it exclusively around the world for tracking dissidents, and basically the software gets rolled out to your device. You don't have to do anything, and it still installs itself. So upgrade your Apple device now.
Absolutely, very good advice. So we are coming towards the end of our hour. We've got one more question that we haven't answered yet. So that is, how complex is the scanning of personal devices, and how often does it need to be done? So I think that's in context of where you've got people with maybe the MDM software onto it. Steve, I guess that one's for you, I'm afraid.
Yeah. So if you're using something like MDM, it's actually fairly straightforward, and it happens without the user knowing about it. It's you can schedule it to run as often as you like. So it's going to be down to your risk appetite. So if you're happy to run it once a month, run it once a month. If you've got a lot of confidential data and everybody's got access to it with their personal devices, you perhaps want to run it a bit more often. Only really if what you're looking for is, have they been updating their antivirus? Have they been updating their software patches, etc. And just to add a point to that, I did mention app antivirus on mobile devices.
Yeah.
Also a good idea. Yeah. The bad guys are now starting to target mobile devices, not just tablets, but also mobile phones. So make sure you're running that.
And lightning chargers, apparently.
Yes.
Yeah, I suppose actually that was one of the things that I got told, was to actually have charging stations rather than letting people connect or charge up their devices through laptops, because of the risk of potentially that virus transfer. Is that something you'd all agree with?
Yeah, I use a one-way diode to connect into USB devices. So if I'm going to connect in my mobile phone to charge, it allows data one way but not the other.
Brilliant.
So that may be an option. Just have a quick look on Amazon or other retailers for that.
So that's a one-way diode.
Yes.
It's really it's really easy to install that kind of software onto company devices where people tend to plug their own personal devices in to charge them as well. So I completely agree with that.
Okay. Christian, any final thoughts from yourself?
No, I'd agree with that. In terms of how the risks associated with plugging devices in, I think that's quite a new one for me. I mean, I'd always thought that in terms of plugging USBs in, but other devices and plugging them in just to charge, it just goes to show exactly how easy it might be, be infected both ways. So besides that, I just had a comment and a point as well about the App Store, thinking again about bad actors. And yeah, if it's true to say that Google doesn't, clear out some of those apps that are on there that are risky and dangerous, it's just such an attractive and appealing way for cyber criminals to target, people who might not realize that what they're downloading isn't legit. So literally nestled amongst all of these different apps is potentially malware that you innocently end up downloading. So they really need to do more around that and to make sure that they're removing things that are harmful.
Brilliant. So I think the main takeaways from hopefully the session has been that companies really need to be clear about their BYOD policy. They need to understand what assets they have, what people are actually utilising, and then when they've decided, I suppose, the level of control they're going to give to their employees, is to make it really clear to the employees about everybody's roles and responsibilities, and have that dialogue between them and the negotiation, which I think is a great word, Christian, about actually what is going forward, this is what we're going to be doing. And staff training is key. So training them actually about cyber hygiene and cyber security, about themselves, protect their family, and actually by doing that you also protect the company as sort of an offshoot, really, isn't it? And it is making it about the personal bit of why the employees will benefit from doing that training, rather than, as you say, doing a click through PowerPoint as quickly as possible. So I think the other things were that we could set up a guest Wi-Fi for devices coming into a network, just so that it's separate from a corporate network, and also having the charging sort of stations. But containerization seems to be the most secure way of having corporate data on personal devices. But again, it all depends on that negotiation you have with your employees. Thank you so much for attending, everybody. So Kim said training and communication and information equals education. I like it a lot. I hope everyone has enjoyed the session. If there are any more questions, we've got a hand up, so I will see if I can get them to come on. And if anyone else has got any questions that you want to ask, put your hand up now and we'll try and come around. Oh, hang on. Paul, do you want to go?
Yeah, hello everyone. First off, thanks to Kim, Christian and Steve for your time today, and everybody else who's been online. Really interesting. I've learned loads. The only comment I wanted to make, actually, Steve, you mentioned about you being in this game so long. You weren't even emails weren't around when you first started off. The only comment I wanted to make about that was genuine conversation with my daughter, who's 16 yesterday, and she's just been offered an interview for a job, a little part-time Saturday job locally where we live in Essex. And it come across on her email on her iPhone, and she said to myself and my wife, "Email? How does that work? How do you use email?" So clearly, the new generation don't even know how to use email. So
it's gone past it. Wow.
So that was
We
it.
are
That's
really feel old now.
I'm sorry, I feel just as old as you too.
That's actually, though, you know, most people. Coming back to that training exercise, isn't it, actually? We expect people to be able to use the apps that we all think of as common. But actually, it's a really good example that actually, even if you think that they should know how to do it, training on actually just how the basics work for anything that they're using is really important. No, like it.
Yeah, and just to that point, Paul, I was at an event a couple of years back where one of the keynote speakers was talking about this, where when you get people who have just left school or just left university coming into your organisation, why do we try to mould them into our working practices? Why don't we talk to them and find out what they want to do and how they've worked, how they've been interacting with technology, and make sure that, or potentially consider upgrading our working practices to be more in line with how they've done it, because they've found easy ways of doing stuff. You know, they've got new ideas, and in the next 20 or 30 years, they are the people who are going to be running the businesses.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Embracing the digital natives.
Absolutely. Yeah. Just teach them how to use email, please.
Yeah, you might need that one. That's brilliant. Unless there are any more questions, I'd just like you to remind you of, if you're not a member of the ECRC already, it's a free of charge membership, and we give out, hopefully, good guidance to help businesses become more cyber resilient. So we should have another webinar in a month's time, and I think we're going to be focusing on what's the difference between IT and cybersecurity. So hopefully that's of interest, and spread the word if you enjoyed it. Thank you so much again for our presenters. It's much fun.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.